Good morning, this is Tom Battle at the TMS Annual Meeting in San Antonio on Monday, March 11th, and I'm honored to be able to interview Stan Howard for the AIME Oral History Series.
Well, thank you, Tom. It's an honor to be selected to do this interview. And when I first received the invitation, I was surprised I was selected. There are so many people in TMS, and I would like to hear many of those oral histories as well. Many people here have such fantastic careers and so on, and it's just an honor to be here today, and I'm happy to visit with you about whatever you think is significant about my life and career.
Well, and I'd like to start, rather than purely chronological, with what unites you and I, is that we both studied under John Hager at the Colorado School of Mines.
That's right.
And to start with, we'll go back to your growing up years, but you, until coming to Colorado, you'd spent your life in Wyoming.
I'm a Wyomingite.
And so how did you get to CSM, and how did that evolve?
Well, I got to Colorado School of Mines almost accidentally or serendipitously, perhaps, you might say. It all happened in high school physics class one afternoon. We met at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Doc Rogers threw a pamphlet, or handed a pamphlet to a good friend of mine, Steve Thomas, whom I'm going to see next week, in fact. We're still friends. And he said to Steve, who was an outstanding student, that he should go to Colorado School of Mines. Steve didn't show much interest, threw the pamphlet down on the table, and I thought, maybe I should look at that. So I grabbed the pamphlet, and I thought, well, that looks good. So I applied to Colorado School of Mines. I had thought about Carnegie Mellon and other places. University of Wyoming had cobwebs on their metallurgy lab door when I was over there visiting, and so
subtle hint there.
Subtle tip that I was not going to the University of Wyoming for metallurgy, and it was metallurgy for sure.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that. So you got to CSM, and how did your undergrad evolve the way you expected it to?
Well, I was never particularly worried about how college would go. I expected it would go fine, and I was so excited about being in a place like that where people knew things that I wanted to know for a long time, for 4 years, a long time when you're a high school student. And it was a quite exciting time, although the first 2 years were not anything to do with metallurgy. It was still interesting, and I enjoyed it and made some good friends, and really benefited from being down there. It was a wonderful opportunity, and I still think that way about it. It's tremendous.
Yeah, it's special.
Tremendous education.
Now, were you planning to go to graduate school from day one?
Yes. I decided to become a PhD when I was in about third grade. And apparently my older brother did as well. We never talked about it, but we both have our PhDs in engineering. And it was because my father spent many evenings with my mother in conversation, just sort of anguished conversation about whether he should go back to school or not. And so one day I asked him, what's the highest degree you can get? And he said, PhD. And so at that moment, it was settled in my mind that's what I would do, because I never wanted to have that anguished discussion about going back to school with my wife when I was in my 30s.
And then how did you end up with John?
Well, I ended up working under John Hager quite by accident. It was Vincent Campos was working for John Hager at the time, and John at the time was pretty demanding, to say, euphemistically. I was working up at Rocky Flats at the time, and he called me in August and asked me if I would be willing to work for him in the fall, because there was this opening. Vincent Campos was going to change advisors and go work for Paul Harold. He did these ternary phase diagram on computer, as I recall. And I said, sure, that'd be great. It turned out to be a just a wonderful opportunity for me, and I always enjoyed working for John Hager, although it was demanding. There were a few times I wanted to tell him to, if he knew how it was to be done, do it himself, but I never said that.
And you worked on mass spec?
I worked on the mass spec with a Knudsen inlet system, and it was a very wonderful piece of equipment. It was brand new at the time, and I ended up maintaining that and operating it for 4 years. So it took me the first time I had to fix it, it took me 2 weeks, but after that I could fix it in about a day or so.
And that equipment was there for years, wasn't it?
It was there for years, and I still have it, in fact, up in South Dakota now.
In my time, one of my colleagues worked with it and spent more time fixing leaks and repairing it than I think taking data. But it was a pioneer instrument for university.
It was, and I built a similar unit with more features myself when I became a professor up at South Dakota School of Mines.
And then as you got toward the end, you were talking about ROTC and going to the Army and all that. Was that after bachelor's or after?
Well, at Colorado School of Mines, we had 2 years of undergraduate ROTC, and then in my second year of grad school, if I wanted to continue, I needed to join the ROTC program because there was a demand for in the draft. And so I got one of the low numbers, like 140 or something, so I was going. And when I called the draft board one day and asked them about it, they said I might go to ROTC. I was told I should do that afternoon, which told me that they were about ready to call me. And I would have been glad to serve, but I wanted to finish my degree.
And that's how it worked out.
It worked out because then that was February of my so-called second year of grad school. And so I couldn't start until that fall, and it was 2 more years after that. So I finished the PhD in 4 years, did not do a master's. That was waived. One of the few students for whom that was waived.
That helps.
Mm-hmm. But I could have done a master's. I had several publications in Met-Trans by then, so would not have been that big a demand on me. Mm-hmm.
Then you ended up not going in the Army or in the service.
Well, on April 22nd, 1971, I was discharged. I had a serious back trouble. I couldn't move for a week at a time. I just laying flat on my back. It turned out to be a muscle spasm, but extremely painful and nothing the Army wanted anything to do with. So I was out on the 22nd of April. But I learned lots of very useful things in ROTC.
Such as?
Well, CPM programming, critical path method, and how to develop lesson plans, and how to blow up bridges, and how to fill trees, and all kinds, how to build a runway and build a road and so on. So it was all very interesting, I thought.
And then Dr. Fuerstenau caught up with you?
Well, Maury Fuerstenau was my professor at Colorado School of Mines as an undergraduate, and a little bit, perhaps the first year or so of grad school. I know I took every course he taught. I think it was around 30 hours of hydromet and flotation, and he had an interesting style of teaching, and I appreciated him and did very well under that style of learning.
And then he wouldn't say no when he moved to South Dakota.
When he went to Utah first, and then was there a few years, and then decided to take the position of department head at South Dakota School of Mines, which was his hometown. As a matter of fact, his parents just live on the other side of the hill from campus. And Maury had Bruce Palmer as a student at the time, a grad student, and Bruce was going to join him and was, in fact, in Rapid City when I went up to interview, but Bruce was still finishing his PhD. So I was actually the first hire Maury made at South Dakota. When I went up to interview in August, because I was sort of scrambling for a position with the departure from ROTC, thinking I would be in the Army for 2 years, Maury met me basically with a contract and didn't bother with the interview because he knew me so well. And
I
had done well under him.
So now, before talking about your academic career, now you can step back and talk about your childhood a bit and what led you into, being an engineer and being a metallurgist. So you grew up it was a relative's farm, right? Your parents were
it's a ranch.
farming. I'm sorry, the ranch before, because your uncle was at the war?
Yeah, well, the history of the ranch, my mother's father, homesteaded that in 1916. And so I was born in 45. And so just before that, of course, was the war years. And my mother's brother, my Uncle Jack, was at the ranch. And my father and mother were down in Denver at Buckley. My father was serving as a carpenter then in the military effort, although he was a civilian. And when my uncle was called up to go up to Alaska to defend the coastline up there, my parents went to the ranch to take over that. My grandfather lived in Torrington, so the ranch was open for occupancy when my uncle left. And my mother loved the ranch. She was 5 years old when it was homesteaded and very much wanted to be there. And so my first home was the ranch and in the prairie in Wyoming, eastern Wyoming.
So growing up, I assume you had your share of chores, and because there were cattle and so on.
We were free-ranging kids, but we had no chores. I don't know how what their philosophy was, but my parents didn't use demands. They used incentive, like compliment or praise, and it seemed to work because I always wanted to just do things that seemed to be my initiative. And so that's kind of my temperament today as well. I don't want to be told. I'd like to be asked. And, it's an interesting way of raising children. I certainly wish I could have done better at it myself with my children.
So you were there, when your uncle came back from the war and went back to the farm, to the ranch?
No, he ended up at Casper doing oil refinery work and so on. So we were at the ranch. My parents, that's before my time, so I think they went there in about 43. I was born in 45, my sister in 48, and then we moved into town in 1950, the big town of Lingle, Wyoming. 307 people.
And it's all ranching country all around it?
When you go from the ranch, which is north of Lingle by 15 miles, you come across the Interstate Canal, built partly by my great uncle earlier. That's kind of a family history. And you cross that canal, which takes water from the Guernsey Whalen Diversion and the Guernsey Dam. There's several irrigation projects. That valley, that North Platte Valley, is a very rich valley and very rich farmland. Mostly sugar beets, corn, beans, those sort of things. So that's very valuable land. Our land was ranch land. It's about $200 an acre a few, decades back, and now I think it's around $500 an acre. But that farmland's thousands per acre.
Yeah, irrigation makes a difference in that
makes all the difference in the world. So we had 6 sections. So that's 6 square miles, but a little over 3,000 acres. We had a little addendum to that. Ran about 200 cow-calf pairs. Had 25 horses.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No pigs or anything like that, or sheep.
It's amazing your parents didn't see you as a workforce, just to keep up all those animals. And
my grandfather would come out twice a week from Torrington. That's about 25 miles. And my father and mother lived there, of course, and so they took care of the cattle. We had 2 milk cows, Red and Bossy. They would come in every afternoon to be milked. I have a lot of memories. And we had chickens. I had a special way of collecting eggs. I'd go into the chicken coop and close the door quietly and then just jump up and down and scream and yell. All the chickens would go flying. There'd be feathers. You couldn't see through them. But I got the chickens off the nest, and then I could grab the eggs.
They've shortened their lifetime a little bit. With
right. I don't think it did anything for egg production, but it certainly made my life easier as a 3-year-old collecting eggs.
So then you moved into the big city.
Moved into Lingle, Wyoming.
And is it when that's where you started schooling?
That's where I started school. Moved in 1950. I was a September baby, September 5th. So I started school a year early. I could have waited a year. Or my parents could have put me a year later. I think my mother was, she had 5 children. So I don't think they were interested in waiting a year and having me around. So at home, if I could go to school. And my brother was the same. He was September 21st, and he was the same sequence, 4 years apart from me. And so we started early and we finished early.
And then, so you were there for how many years?
Through 5th grade, 1956. A decision had to be made. It was kind of tough for my parents to make a living in Lingle. I think the deciding factor for my father leaving and going down to Cheyenne to work during the week at the air base was an election. He ran for superintendent of schools. He had, before the war and before Berkeley, he was a superintendent of schools, taught math and so on, and east of Cheyenne, Carpenter and Egbert, Wyoming. And so he ran for superintendent of schools, and it was a very close election. He lost by 3 votes. It was finally decided after 3 days to Vilma Linford. And when that happened, I think my father realized he had to take employment down in Cheyenne at that point and commuted for several years. And finally, we moved to Cheyenne.
That must have been a fun commute. That was a ways. I mean,
it's
far
about
enough.
93 miles. 93 miles. And in those days, cars were not as reliable and roads are as good. But they were okay.
Yeah, no interstates, or they were just being built.
And still isn't. It's Highway 80. I never can remember if it's 85 or 87, but I think it's 85.
Oh, U.S. Highway?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You have to go down through east to Torrington, 10 miles, and then south, 83 miles to Cheyenne.
And then what did you think about moving to Cheyenne? Were you ready for it, or?
No, I did not want to go to Cheyenne. I had a very nice life in Lingle as a boy. I had good friends. I had one friend who was particularly dear to me, Bob Bamer. Of course, at that time, it was Bobby Bamer. And his parents ran the dairy out east of town. And I would walk out there 4 miles. Can you imagine that today? A grade school kid walking down the highway for 4 miles to go to his friend's house. I always tried to time it early enough in the morning so that I'd intercept the milk truck, the delivery truck that his brother or father would drive, and I could thumb a ride out. But there are many days I walked, and there's a dirt road as well. It's a little farther I could walk. But I would walk out there and spend a lot of summer days with Bob. He had an old horse that we would clomp around on. So many wonderful things we did.
And then somewhere along that time, Sputnik happened.
Sputnik happened after I moved to Cheyenne. That would have been 1957. I think it was February, if I'm not mistaken, but I don't like thinking about it because it was so disturbing to me. I read a lot about astronomy, and by the time I was in Cheyenne, I was reading about the space wheel, and I think that was von Braun wrote about that. And I guess they thought they needed gravity or something to live in space. So I was very interested in the satellite program. And I would watch those Vanguard missiles rise off the launch pad at Cape Canaveral and go about 3 feet and then fall over and blow up. And it was so aggravating to me because I was such a space nut.
So you must have watched the right stuff.
Oh,
and
yeah.
They have those early scenes where they show the Russians succeeding and ours just dismally failing.
And the Cold War was vivid in our minds. I mean, I was in Cheyenne. That was the ICBM base.
You were a target.
Yeah, we were the target. And the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1960, that was real. We were packing up, headed for the ranch that day. But at any rate, it was very aggravating to me. Some people say in that era, everyone remembers where you were when Kennedy was assassinated. I don't remember that for sure, but I know exactly where I was and what I felt and what I thought when I heard that the Soviets had launched their satellite. I was on the 3rd step coming out of the basement. My father was at the top of the stairs and said, down the stairs to me. And I was so angry. I think I said some words I shouldn't have said, and I went right out the back door outside to sulk. I was very upset.
And then you decided that single-handedly you'd rescue the U.S. rocket program.
Yes, well, youth needs a goal, right? So Bobby was down from Lingle in the summer after that, just a few months, and we were a little bored. And incidentally, I think boredom is a wonderful thing for children because it creates a demand to do something different.
Be creative.
Yeah, to be creative. So we decided we should build rockets. And he went home, and I continued to build rockets. And I found another friend at junior high school. By that time, that was 1957, Russell Hauser. Russell's still a friend today and is still living there in Cheyenne. And he had all kinds of formulas for rocket fuel and so on, and we built rockets, lots of rockets. And we found out they blew up just like the Vanguard. And so we made a lot of bombs. I mean, we'd go so far as to model a rocket that we knew would blow up. So,
well, of course.
So kids. You
didn't quite tell your parents you were going to do that, though.
Well, my parents were concerned, but they thought allowing me to pursue my scientific interests was in my general interest. Mm-hmm.
So we do have to ask about your biggest disaster with rockets.
When you make rockets,
it was a learning it was an opportunity.
One day, for some reason, I thought I was going to make an aerial display. I was kind of impressed with the 4th of July aerial bombs, and the big shells that blow up. And so I was making one of those. And of course, to expedite things, I just used steel pipe and instead of cardboard and all of that, because I knew that would blow apart. But so I had a fuse break, and I was disassembling it, and I was trying to be careful because I knew the risks from static electricity and so on, but it went off in my hand. I had the steel pipe. Fortunately, it didn't rip apart, but I still have never found the coupling on the end of that. I think it went through the lath ceiling, but it blew a big hole in the zinc top countertop I had and did some very strange things, like melting the wire. The hanger I was using to disassemble it, and it melted on a plastic sheet in the form of the plastic without melting the plastic. I don't know how that happened yet. But at any rate, it was quite an explosion. And I remember walking up the stairs. I was unwilling to look at my hand because I figured it was gone. But when my dad ran past me looking for Russell, I thought, well, maybe it's not. Or he would have stopped
Didn't
with
make
me.
a big fuss.
And so then up those stairs, the same stairs that I heard about the Sputnik thing a few years earlier, I was willing to look at my hand, and it was a little bloodied, but it was okay. And that's why I don't hear very well out of my right ear. But it blew my shirt off, the front of the shirt off.
Did you save the shirt? That'd
No,
be a nice
it was a
thing
nice shirt. I liked it. I wish I had it. It would be kind of an interesting display item, I guess, if anyone were interested.
So obviously the rocket stories tell us you had to become a metallurgist and a chemist, and yes, a demolitions expert, just to make these devices and power them and so on. And another of your formative phases was your interest, as you mentioned, in astronomy, but also Greek mythology or mythology in general through your mother. And we haven't talked about your mother, but she sounds like she was very educated.
Yes,
right?
I was blessed by having two wonderful parents, and I just can't express enough appreciation for my parents. Neither one is living at this point, but my mother was a graduate of Cornell University, and she studied Greek mythology and Latin. And my father was a mathematician and bound to be a minister and a philosopher, but switched mostly to teaching mathematics and superintendent of schools, that
And
sort of thing.
carpentry.
And carpentry, and he was an electrician, and he was a Renaissance man, and a very humble man. I never heard either of my parents ever rail or seethe. They were very constructive. My mother was the director of social services in Cheyenne, and they were just wonderful parents. My mother, having that background in Greek mythology, when we're at the ranch, of course, there's no lights to bother looking at the sky, and we would lay out in the summertime on blankets or have time outside, and my mother would tell stories about the constellations and point out all the stars and tell us the stories from the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so Homer's characters were our heroes, Achilles and Agamemnon. And, when we played as kids, we always wanted to be Achilles. Or Hector, I want to be Hector. I want to be Agamemnon. And I can't say it. And I did pretty well the first time I tried it.
Yeah.
But those were our heroes. And that's all because of my mother. And so they were tremendous parents and made a tremendous difference to me, and I just can't express enough gratitude.
Now, is it too far to go from metallurgy and Greek mythology to bladesmithing?
Well, see, I always wanted to know how things worked. I always science, and I don't know where that comes from. One thing I did want to make sure I said during this interview was that I was a slow student. I could not read. I could not use the English language until I was about 4. My brothers, I had 2 older brothers, 4 and 5 years older. We lived in the ranch. I did not speak English until, recognizable English till age 3 or 4. And I had words, but I just had my kind of own language, and my brothers interpreted for me, I guess. My mother kind of understood that. And when I went to grade school, the first grade teacher did not teach me to read, or my class. There were 2 classes, one learned, one didn't. And so it was the start of 4th grade, 3rd or 4th grade, we had remedial reading. And I remember my mother actually volunteered to come in and teach us. So I learned to read in about 3rd grade, but I was always interested in how things worked. And one of the wonderful things that happened to me was my brother, when I was in junior high school, brought home to me a book that the high school had thrown away on chemistry lab experiments. I still have it. And it had all these wonderful experiments that you could do, and a whole list of all the equipment you needed for chemistry experiments. And I just poured through that. I just desperately wanted to have that chem lab. And when I added up the price of all the equipment, it was like $60. And I had, or maybe it was $200, I don't know. Anyway, it was just an unattainable number. And so I thought I'd make my own glassware. So on a snow day, I cranked up the wood range down in the basement, got the vacuum cleaner and threw some coal in and some pop bottles and started milling glass. And before long, I was down in the library, State Library and Carnegie Library. Bless Carnegie for providing that library in Cheyenne and the State Library. And I read prolifically. I lived in those libraries. I was sorry when they closed at 5 o'clock at the State Library. And then I found out all this metallurgy, information about metallurgical furnaces. And so by 8th grade, it was definite in my mind that I was going to be a metallurgist, and I loved high temperatures. I'd always liked fire and heat, and, what youth doesn't. So.
And you decided a PhD at that time, you
said.
PhD
was decided. Yeah, PhD was decided in 4th grade, and metallurgy was decided in 8th grade. And so the first time I ever melted a large quantity of glass in a separate room I had where I could do such things in this wonderful home that my parents bought, I put in the steel rod or iron rod, rolled a ball of glass, and blew a perfect sphere. But I never was able to do it again.
First time.
First time, beginner's luck.
And so you did obviously well enough in high school to get into CSM, which has pretty high standards. It sounds like you learned your first couple of years at CSM may have been boring because you already knew the math and chemistry and physics, I suspect.
Well,
I was on your own as well.
Yes, I learned a lot of things on my own and with my father's help. My father being a mathematician, I was in advanced math. I was blessed with being very good at math. I think I could do all the times tables before I could read, probably. But it wasn't an unusual schedule. It's just that my reading was delayed. But I knew calculus and all of that when I went. And I taught myself chemistry. My good friend Russell and Steve Johnson, we sat out in the apple tree. We got a high school chemistry book, and we read that. That's what we did.
It's your recreational reading.
We sat out in the apple tree and read that chemistry book, one page at a time, and pored over it and discussed it and thought about it. And so we were conversant in chemistry by 8th grade. I also read a lot. One of my favorite books was Allison Butt's Metallurgical Problems, and I just found a copy of that on eBay, and I bought it. And when I opened up that book and looked in there, I just thought, holy smokes, I remember this page.
It took you back.
He didn't. The thing I was most interested in was flame temperature. He did not call it adiabatic flame temperature, but flame temperature. And my father and I sat at the dining room table poring over that book many nights. So when I went to Dakota School of Mines, I had these questions, like where's the heat transfer coefficient come from? And I didn't learn that until grad school. John Hager stumbled across it one day in a lecture, and I'm like, oh, that's where the number, how you get the number. I knew how to use the number. I didn't know where it came from.
So now we've talked about the CSM years. So now you show up in Rapid City. You'd never been there before, except to interview?
Oh, no. Rapid City was a vacation spot for my family.
Okay.
The ranch north of Lingle there, it's probably 180 miles to the Black Hills, and that was one of our favorite vacation spots. So we'd go to Hot Springs quite often and stay there and swim in Evans Plunge. And so I was quite familiar with the Black Hills. It always seemed like a vacation spot. So when I went up to interview and thought I might live there, it was sort of surrealistic in a way. I never intended to stay close to home, but, I have. I've stayed between Denver and Rapid City my career. And I always thought I'd go to Pittsburgh and make steel. That's what I thought I'd do.
So going back again to your CSM years, when I was there, I didn't realize there was a class in flamethrowers. But apparently that's, you invented that.
Well, that's actually in my Cheyenne time period. Jim Robinson had asked me to mention that. He had heard this story before, and last night at dinner he asked me to be sure to include that in this interview. Being interested in all things scientific, one of the things I wanted to do as a youth and junior high and those years transitioning to high school was build a turbine jet engine. But of course, it's far beyond my mechanical abilities as a youth and or even an adult at this point.
Can you do it now?
I could not build a turbine engine, but they were fascinating to me. I was just fascinated. But I thought, well, maybe I could make a ramjet. So I got a steel tube and a conduit, actually, and necked it down and put a spark plug in it and got an IV bottle from the hospital, trash. Can you imagine going to a hospital and getting an old IV bottle? Filled it with kerosene, which you should never do, but I did, and then ran a hose down to the steel pipe, and I bolted it to the floor because I figured it would take off. And then I got the vacuum cleaner and blew through there. It turned out it just was a wonderful flamethrower. I put it in the garage, bolted it to the garage floor, and opened up the garage doors adjacent to the sidewalk. And we'd fill it up with kerosene and then fire it. And what it would do is it'd make a ball of flame about 8 feet in diameter. And the wind was always just right that it would just slowly roll down the sidewalk and extinguish itself over about 100 feet. Fortunately, no pedestrians.
Well, yeah, I was thinking you were doing that in your basement. And
no,
at least you were.
That was outside
Wise
summer
enough
days,
to-
but I don't think it ever developed much power. I could see that that wasn't going to amount to much of anything, but it was an interesting kind of flamethrower, it turned out. We enjoyed all that. But in CSM, there was another story that people found, Jim had found interesting, and that was, it was so cold down there in the wintertime, as it is in Wyoming and South Dakota. One cold spell we decided we'd capitalize on. I lived in a third floor apartment. We had a veranda at 3 floors up. And I thought, we should just grow an icicle. So I got a big plastic trash can, about 30 gallon, 40 gallon, and put a drip on it over the edge. And we grew an icicle about 6 feet in diameter and 3 floors high. We started putting food coloring in it. We grew the whole thing. It was just huge. And so then, as it does in Colorado, shortly after it was 70 degrees out, we're down underneath it taking a picture, and I heard a crack, and I said, everybody step back under the concrete overhang, and that whole thing came down, chunks of ice about the size of Volkswagens coming down. But it was that was a fun experiment.
Yeah, obviously, you had too much time on your hands.
Well, yeah, we didn't have much time at Colorado School of Mines. We took 168 credit hours.
You work hard and you play hard.
Yeah, that's what they said. Yeah, work hard and play hard. That was the goal.
So then let's again move into the South Dakota years. So you show up. Had you done student teaching? You'd been a TA or something? So you had a little.
No, I never was a TA. I always had research. I was an RA at Colorado School of Mines.
Yeah, research
and the
assistant.
St. Joe Fellow. I appreciate them.
So was I.
Yes. And I had a National Education Defense Act as a result of Sputnik. So it paid off.
For you, yeah.
Later, a
2 years
benefit.
later.
$1,450, I think I got. And my first stipend was $222.22 a month. And I was never better off. My wife worked, and we had married student housing. I spent a lot of my time down at the First National Bank in Denver doing loans and stock transactions and hanging out at Bates Incorporated. So I was able to invest. I started investing when I was in 7th grade. Always liked investments, interest.
And that's valuable for an engineer to
Time
know
value
at least
money.
something about the real world,
Right.
rather than just. So when you came to Rapid City, you developed. They assigned you classes to teach.
They surely did. I taught 14 credit hours the second semester I was there.
Was there at least previous notes from professors, or did you have to start from scratch?
Well, when I started teaching, I thought I was going to teach just like the best professors I had at Colorado School of Mines.
A bit from each of them?
Yes, or I would model after one or another, and I would just correct what I thought they did wrong. But after about a week of that, you realize you can't be somebody else. You have to be yourself. And so I quickly adapted to that thinking and started teaching my own style.
And you pretty much created all your notes, your lecture notes from scratch, or did you have some?
I did. Well, I have all my notes from Colorado School of Mines to this day. I have everyone. After I became a serious student, I wasn't that organized as a freshman or sophomore, but as a junior and senior, I was fastidious. I had to be. And, I started getting all A's as opposed to just learning the material. I was determined to be, know everything. And it became because I was in metallurgy then. I wasn't just doing all this preparatory work. It's not as interesting. But I still have all those notes, and I tried to pattern after those. But after a short time, you realize, first of all, I couldn't use Denby as a thermal book because at Colorado School of Mines and metallurgical thermal, that's the third thermal course, not the first. And I was teaching students the first thermal course. So I used Makoviak for a while, and then Gaskell later came out with his book, and I used it. But I wrote all my notes, and then I'd redo my notes. And after about the third year, you realize you don't need notes. So I haven't used notes for any of my classes after about the third year. I just go in and I can lecture start to finish any one of 10 classes. It's just natural.
Yep. It's ingrained in your...
Yeah, who needs
memory.
notes to teach heat transfer? I mean, my goodness. I can drive all the equations. I can tell you what page number they're on and where the Gibbs-Helmholtz equation is in Gaskell.
And they're still using Bird, Stewart, and Lightfoot.
Bird, Stewart.
I don't know about right now.
Well, I used Geiger's book.
For a long time.
Gordon Geiger and Poirier. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. And then Gaskell's thermodynamics.
Yes. And I've read my own thermo book, too. It's online. Or at least the first half of it is.
So is that your record, was 14?
Yes. I even taught physical metallurgy 1, and I'm not a physical metallurgist, but we were in faculty transition period, and I was asked to jump in that class a week or two into the semester. And, I'm not totally ignorant of physical metallurgy. I have some, and so I taught that in the lab, but it's not my forte, and it's not my particular interest.
But you realize quickly that, well, you're probably more knowledgeable than the students, so they don't realize if you're confident.
Right. Well, I do know what I'm talking about. Don't say that.
I didn't mean it quite that way, but that's that old story about saying about how you don't really learn something till you have to teach it.
Oh, there is no doubt I benefited greatly in knowing thermo and heat transfer by teaching. No doubt. And that's a great satisfaction to me. I just always wanted to know how things worked and how the world worked. And to this day, when I go to sleep at night, I think about, isn't it wonderful that I have been able to acquire that knowledge from other people, other giant, I'm not the giant, but Denby and Gibbs, and those people. I mean, it's just fantastic to think that I've been afforded the opportunity to just learn this stuff. It's just wonderful. It's just thrilling to me.
Well, and then, as I think you said, to see the students catch it.
Oh, and that's
because thermodynamics is a subject that you get it or you don't, and there's different ways to get it. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of subjects I think are like that, and one approach may work great with one student, but the other student is still totally out to sea.
Well, I am an educator, and I've certainly come to recognize students learn differently. They do, but it's a great satisfaction to teach students and help them learn this material. I just went back into teaching after being retired for a couple of years because I wanted to have that interaction with the students. It's thrilling. It's exciting to me. I enjoy it greatly.
Now, what was the focus at South Dakota? Was it you do research X% of your time, or it's
evolved over the years. Yeah. When I first went up there, I remember telling the president in the interview that I had with him that we needed to get more research. So we were all excited about research and doing more of it. In the last few years, it's particularly now very demanding.
The publisher peerish kind of thing.
And yes, very demanding standards. But we contract for a certain percentage each semester, each year. How much research, how much teaching, and so on. I'm out of that now. I'm just teaching part-time, but I'm there 50 hours a week, writing and publishing.
Only 50.
Yeah, I always like to say, nice thing about teaching is you could do your 80 hours whenever you wanted. Very flexible. And that's what we did. We did every day. Every day we were down at school.
And so talk about a little of your research. It sounds like you were fortunate enough to be able to continue your PhD work or with the similar equipment.
Yes.
And not everyone gets that opportunity. Some never want to see it again,
Right.
whatever they worked on.
Well, I built my own equipment. I mean,
You knew it backwards and forwards.
Yes.
From your...
Yes. So I built a Knudsen inlet system, a valved Knudsen inlet system where I could actually change the composition inside the crucible and the Knudsen cell as I monitored the ion currents or the effusate with the mass spec. So you could start with a pure metal, like pure gold, and start dropping alloy additions and pre-weighed, and then you know the composition, then you can track the ion current of the gold and measure activities directly. Very nice for multi-component systems.
I remember they did a lot of chlorides at CSM. That was a little after.
Well,
did you get into chlorides? Or?
Bob Hill worked in the gold chloride system on that 3012 mass spec, as I recall the number was. And I never had much to do with that.
What were the major things you were measuring?
Well, I was doing thermodynamic activities of liquid metallic solutions.
And there was little or no data on most of those systems before. Or were you
That's true.
Or were you
That's true.
narrowing down the error bars on?
Well, a little of both. A little of both.
And then what other new research did you get into as you kind of built that part of your career?
Well, we were doing multi-component solutions, germanium, gold. I mean, those are easy to do with the mass spec. The vapor pressures are all about right. So copper, germanium, gold, silver are nice selections. Nice systems to work in. It's been interesting to me over the years that of late people are looking at those things for solders. So I see that my work's kind of cited in some of those articles. It's gratifying. But I never stood still. I did a lot of different things. I guess one might say I'm bored easily. Or once I learn how something works, I want to move on and do something different. And I've done a lot of different things over the years. So we can talk about that as you would like.
At length. And some of that is what the funding agencies are looking for at a given time, to a certain extent, right? If you had to rely, I don't know if you relied much on NSF money or Bureau of Mines or things like that, where they're looking for certain things, whether it's what you really wanted to do.
Well, sometimes it's difficult to get funding at a school that doesn't have that history. And I used to cast about for different areas for funding, and I've done a lot of different things. But one of the more interesting things that I find some satisfaction in having done was I developed it with colleagues, Wendell Dunn in particular, a chlorination process for processing tantalum and making tantalum products and niobium. It was called Group 5 Metals. We ran it in Rapid City.
Wendell Dunn used to work for DuPont.
Yes.
Didn't he? I remember his
worked
name.
With Gore.
So titanium tetrachloride.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I met Wendell Wendell was one of the people I really wanted to mention in this interview. I met him in 1980, as I recall, in Chicago at the TMS meeting. And it was very odd. I didn't believe he was for real at first because we're doing a social gathering there at TMS, and I came across him and I saw his badge and it said Spearfish, South Dakota, which is 50 miles from me. And I asked about that, and I said, "What kind of metallurgy do you do?" And he said, "I do chlorination metallurgy," which I was interested in, and I'd written proposals on and done some work in. And I couldn't believe that somebody would be in Spearfish, South Dakota doing chlorination metallurgy. Well, it turned out Wendell and I and a friend of mine, Dan Sarda and Glenn Stone, started this company, Group 5 Metals, shortly after that because people were bringing in tantalum compounds to have us evaluate them from the Black Hills. So we decided we'd just start a company. Well, Dan Sarda and I decided to do that. Then Wendell joined us. Good thing, because Wendell knew what he was doing. we probably wouldn't.
You had
have
more
as much.
enthusiasm than you had.
And he had a lot of experience, so we benefited.
Was he retired then?
Yes. Wendell and Gore were friends at DuPont. Gore-Tex. Wendell brought into my office one day a stack of Gore-Tex stock issues, big sheets, probably an inch and a half thick. He just said, I was taking these to the bank. I thought you might want to look at them. I don't know what that was worth, but it was a considerable sum. Yes,
I remember the stories of Gore-Tex and developed at DuPont. They really didn't see a future in it, and they let Gore take the patents with him, if I recall.
Yes, and then he tried to, as Wendell tells the story, tried to get someone to buy the technology, and they said, "We'll just loan you the money. You should do it." The banker told him, so that's how Gore-Tex started. But Wendell was a great partner. I enjoyed working with Wendell, and we were quite successful in producing ultra-high or very high purity niobium oxides. That was the business. It turned out a year later. And we originally thought we'd make tantalum metal, which we did. And but the market was to take niobium oxide from Colombia and tin slags from Malaysia and turn it into niobium oxide high purity for lenses and lithium niobate switches.
And how long did that company last, or your involvement with it?
Well, it ran for 3-4 years, and then it was sold off. We were a licensing company, and the operating company sold it, so it disappeared from Rapid City.
And how much of your your second 100% of your time did you spend with that?
I spent a lot of time as a consultant working on that project.
Did you get into the financial stuff with your interest in?
It was very much worth our time, and we were very much involved. Actually, Wendell's son was a member of our corporation, and he was a graduate of the Wharton School of Business, and he advised us in some very important ways to succeed. Very grateful to him.
So you sold that because of it's kind of the market.
Well, that was the operating company's choice. So they sold it, and we were just a licensing company. And so we sold, at that point, we sold the licensing information with it. So we were out of the business. We're not really operators. We're just, we developed technology, basically.
Had tried to have fun.